The tropical heat of Guadalcanal hit like a wall of steam, thick and suffocating. Sergeant James Mitchell wiped the sweat from his brow as he crouched behind a fallen palm tree, the stench of rotting vegetation mixing with gunpowder and salt from the nearby ocean. It was August 1942, and the Marines had been fighting for control of this God-forsaken island for weeks. Every day brought new challenges, new casualties, and new questions about whether they would survive to see another sunrise. Mitchell was a mechanic before the war, spending his days in a garage in rural Pennsylvania, fixing tractors and automobiles. He understood machines in a way that most men understood people. He could listen to an engine and know what was wrong, could disassemble and reassemble almost anything with moving parts. That skill had made him invaluable to his unit, but it also gave him a perspective that most combat Marines did not have. He saw weapons not just as tools of war, but as machines that could be improved, modified, adapted. The problem they faced was simple but deadly. The Japanese had established fortified positions throughout the dense jungle, machine gun nests that could cut down entire squads before anyone could get close enough to neutralize them. The Marines had rifles, grenades, and light machine guns, but nothing with the sustained firepower needed to suppress these positions long enough for an assault. Men were dying, and Mitchell watched it happen day after day, feeling helpless despite his technical knowledge. If you are enjoying this story and want to see more content like this, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. It really helps us continue bringing you these incredible true stories from history. The breakthrough came on a sweltering afternoon when Mitchell was assigned to salvage parts from a downed American fighter plane that had crashed in a clearing about half a mile from their position. The Wildcat had gone down during an aerial engagement, its pilot lost, but the aircraft relatively intact. As Mitchell surveyed the wreckage, his eyes fell on the Browning machine gun mounted in the wing. It was a .50 caliber weapon designed for air combat, capable of firing over 800 rounds per minute. The gun was still functional, and suddenly Mitchell saw possibility where others saw only scrap metal. He spent that entire evening studying the weapon, turning it over in his hands, examining the feed mechanism, the cooling system, the mounting brackets. The gun was too heavy for one man to carry and fire, and it was designed to be mounted on an aircraft, not used on the ground. But Mitchell's mind was already working through the problems, visualizing solutions. He could adapt the mounting system, create a tripod from salvaged materials, maybe even rig up a better cooling solution to prevent overheating during sustained fire. The next morning, Mitchell approached his commanding officer, Lieutenant Robert Hayes, with his idea. Hayes was a graduate of Annapolis, a by-the-book officer who had earned the respect of his men through competence rather than warmth. He listened as Mitchell explained his plan to modify the aircraft gun for ground use, his expression skeptical but not dismissive. "I understand your thinking, Sergeant, but that weapon was not designed for infantry use. The recoil alone would be unmanageable, and we do not have the ammunition supply to support that rate of fire." Hayes tapped his fingers on the makeshift desk, a piece of plywood balanced on 2 crates. "Besides, if this fails, we will have wasted valuable time and resources." Mitchell expected this response. He had prepared his argument carefully. "Sir, with respect, we are losing men every day to those fortified positions. Our current weapons do not have the firepower to keep their heads down long enough for our riflemen to advance. This gun could change that. I can make it work. I just need 3 days and permission to requisition the materials I need." Hayes studied the young sergeant for a long moment. Mitchell was only 24, but he had an intensity about him, a quiet confidence that came from genuine competence rather than bravado. The lieutenant had seen too many good men die in frontal assaults against prepared positions. If there was even a chance that Mitchell's idea could save lives, it was worth the risk. 3 days, Sergeant. But if this does not work, you will be back on regular duty, and I will not hear another word about experimental weapons. Understood? Understood, sir. Thank you, sir. Mitchell gathered a small team of men who had mechanical aptitude. Corporal Danny Torres from New Mexico, who had worked in his father's metalworking shop, Private First Class William Chen from San Francisco, who had been studying engineering before the war, and Private Eugene Kowalski from Chicago, who could weld like an artist. Together, they worked around the clock, ignoring the heat, the mosquitoes, and the distant sound of artillery. The first challenge was the mounting system. The aircraft gun had been designed to be bolted to the rigid structure of an airplane wing, with the entire aircraft absorbing the recoil. For ground use, they needed something stable enough to handle the violent kickback, but portable enough to be moved by a small team. Mitchell designed a triangular base using steel from the crashed plane's landing gear, reinforced with cross-bracing. The gun itself would be mounted on a swivel joint that allowed for horizontal and limited vertical movement. Torres proved invaluable in fabricating the metal components. He worked with a cutting torch and a portable anvil, shaping the steel pieces with precision despite the primitive conditions. The sound of hammering metal became a constant backdrop in their small corner of the camp, drawing curious looks from other Marines who wondered what these men were building. The ammunition feed system required complete redesign. The aircraft version had used a belt feed that dropped spent casings inside the wing. For ground use, they needed the casings to eject clear of the weapon to prevent jamming, and they needed a way to quickly change ammunition belts during combat. Chen tackled this problem with the methodical approach of an engineer, sketching designs in the dirt before committing to metal. He created a side ejection system using springs salvaged from vehicle suspension systems and a quick-release mechanism for the belt that could be operated with one hand. The cooling system was perhaps the most critical modification. Aircraft guns were cooled by the airflow at high altitude and high speed. On the ground, there would be no such cooling, and sustained fire would cause the barrel to overheat, potentially warping it or causing catastrophic failure. Kowalski built a water jacket around the barrel using sheet metal from the plane's fuselage with a small reservoir that would need to be refilled between engagements. It was not perfect, but it would allow for much longer bursts of fire than the original design. By the end of the second day, they had a working prototype. It was ugly, a Frankenstein creation of aircraft parts, vehicle components, and improvised metalwork. But when Mitchell loaded a test belt and pulled the trigger, the gun roared to life with a sound like tearing canvas. Trees 50 yards away disintegrated under the stream of heavy bullets, and Mitchell felt the mounting system hold steady despite the tremendous recoil. Word spread quickly through the camp. By the third day, a small crowd had gathered to watch the test firing. Lieutenant Hayes stood at the front, arms crossed, his expression carefully neutral. Mitchell and his team had set up targets at various ranges, and now it was time to demonstrate what their creation could do. Mitchell settled behind the gun, feeling the weight of expectations on his shoulders. He had Chen feeding the ammunition belt, Torres ready with water to refill the cooling system, and Kowalski standing by with tools in case any adjustments were needed. He took a deep breath, aimed at the nearest target, and opened fire. The gun performed beyond his expectations. The mounting system absorbed the recoil beautifully, allowing him to maintain accurate fire on target after target. He swept the barrel across the range, and wherever he aimed, wood and earth exploded in fountains of debris. After firing nearly 200 rounds in controlled bursts, he released the trigger and looked back at Lieutenant Hayes. The lieutenant was no longer maintaining his neutral expression. He was grinning. "That is the most beautiful thing I have seen since we landed on this island, Sergeant. How soon can you have it ready for combat?" "It is ready now, sir. We just need to transport it to wherever you need it. The opportunity came sooner than anyone expected. intelligence reported that the Japanese were reinforcing a position along the Lunga River, a natural defensive line that controlled access to a strategic hill. The Marines needed to take that hill, but it meant crossing open ground under fire from multiple machine gun positions. Previous attempts had failed with heavy casualties. This time, Lieutenant Hayes decided to try something different. The plan was straightforward. Mitchell and his team would set up their modified gun on a slight rise that overlooked the Japanese positions. They would lay down suppressive fire, forcing the enemy to keep their heads down, while two squads of riflemen advanced under that cover. Once the riflemen were in position, they would assault the nearest machine gun nest, while Mitchell continued to suppress the others. They moved into position before dawn, 4 men carrying the gun and mounting system, 2 more carrying ammunition and water. The jungle was alive with the sounds of insects and birds, a peaceful soundtrack that belied the violence to come. Mitchell felt his heart pounding as they set up, his hands moving automatically through the familiar motions of assembly and preparation. As the sky began to lighten, revealing the Japanese positions in the distance, Mitchell could see the fortifications clearly. Sandbags and logs formed protective barriers, with firing slits barely visible in the dim light. He knew that behind those slits were men just like him, far from home, following orders, trying to survive. But he also knew that if he hesitated, if he failed to do his job, American Marines would die. Lieutenant Hayes gave the signal. Mitchell opened fire. The effect was immediate and devastating. The heavy .50 caliber rounds tore through the Japanese fortifications like they were made of paper. Sandbags exploded, logs splintered, and the enemy soldiers who had felt safe behind their barriers suddenly found themselves exposed to a weapon they had never encountered at ground level. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous roar that drowned out all other noise on the battlefield. Mitchell swept the gun from left to right, methodically engaging each position, giving none of them time to return effective fire. He could see movement behind the fortifications, soldiers trying to relocate, trying to find cover, but there was nowhere to hide from the devastating firepower he was unleashing. Chen kept the ammunition flowing smoothly, Torres stood ready with water, and Kowalski monitored the gun for any signs of malfunction. The American riflemen advanced in rushes, moving from cover to cover, while Mitchell kept the enemy suppressed. They covered ground that had been considered impassable, reaching the base of the Japanese positions in less than 5 minutes. Mitchell shifted his fire to the flanking positions, allowing the assault teams to focus on the nearest nest. What happened next became the stuff of legend in the Marine Corps. With the riflemen assaulting from the front and Mitchell's devastating fire preventing any reinforcement or effective resistance, the Japanese position collapsed. The Marines took the machine gun nests one by one, methodically clearing each position. The entire engagement lasted less than 20 minutes, and when it was over, the strategic hill was in American hands. The cost was staggering, but not to the Marines. Mitchell's gun had fired over 1,500 rounds, and by conservative estimates, it had neutralized at least 20 enemy soldiers per minute of sustained fire. More importantly, not a single Marine had been killed in the assault, and only 3 had sustained minor wounds. It was an unprecedented success, and word of it spread through the division like wildfire. But Mitchell felt no elation, no sense of triumph. That night, lying in his tent, listening to the rain drum on the canvas, all he could think about were the men he had killed. They had families, dreams, lives that had been cut short by his innovation. He understood the necessity of what he had done, understood that his actions had saved the lives of his fellow Marines, but that understanding did not make it easier to live with. Corporal Torres found him sitting alone by the gun the next morning, running a cleaning rod through the barrel with mechanical precision. "Hey, Mitch, you okay?" Mitchell did not look up. "I built this to save lives, our lives. I just did not think about how many others would end because of it." Torres sat down next to him, his own expression troubled. I know what you mean. My uncle used to say that war turns men into machines and machines into monsters. But what you did yesterday saved a lot of good men. That has to count for something. Does it? Mitchell finally met his friend's eyes. I am a mechanic, Danny. I fix things. I make things work better. Now I have made something that kills more efficiently than anything else on this island. What does that make me? It makes you a Marine doing his job in a war we did not start. Torres put a hand on Mitchell's shoulder. You think those Japanese machine gunners felt guilty about the Marines they killed? You think they questioned whether what they were doing was right? They were following orders, protecting their position, just like we are. The difference is, we have you, and you gave us an advantage. You gave us a chance to go home. Mitchell wanted to believe that. He wanted to accept that his actions were justified by the circumstances, that the mathematics of war made killing 20 enemy soldiers to save one Marine a reasonable exchange. But a part of him, the part that used to fix tractors and help neighbors with their broken-down cars, struggled with what he had become. The next few weeks brought more opportunities to use the modified gun. Each time, it performed flawlessly, and each time, the casualty ratios were similarly lopsided. Mitchell became known throughout the division as the man who had changed the rules of ground combat, who had taken a weapon designed for the sky and made it a terror on the earth. Other units requested his presence, other mechanics tried to replicate his design, and officers studied his tactics. But with each engagement, Mitchell felt himself changing. He became more distant, more mechanical in his approach to combat. He stopped learning the names of the men in his unit, stopped forming friendships beyond the small team that maintained his gun. It was easier that way, easier to focus on the technical aspects of his work and ignore the human cost. Private Chen noticed the change. He was the youngest of the team, barely 19, with a gentle manner that seemed out of place in the brutality of war. One evening, after they had successfully supported another assault, Chen approached Mitchell with concern evident on his face. "Sergeant, can I speak with you privately?" Mitchell nodded, walking with the young private to a quiet spot away from the others. Chen hesitated, clearly struggling with how to begin. "Sir, I am worried about you. Ever since we built this gun, you have been different. You barely sleep, you barely eat, and when we are not in combat, you just stare at nothing. The men are starting to notice. I'm fine, Private, just focused on the mission. With respect, sir, you are not fine. My grandfather was in the last war, and he told me about what happened to men who stopped feeling, who turned themselves into machines to survive. He said it was like watching them die from the inside." Mitchell felt a flash of anger, but it died quickly, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. "What do you want me to do, Chen? Fall apart every time we use this thing? Cry for the enemy soldiers who would kill us without hesitation if our positions were reversed? I built this weapon, and now I have to live with what it does." "No, sir." Chen's voice was soft but firm. "You do not have to live with it alone. That is what the team is for. That is what friends are for. We all pulled the trigger on this thing in one way or another. Torres made the mount, I made the feed system, Kowalski made it safe to fire. We are all responsible. You do not have to carry this by yourself." For the first time in weeks, Mitchell felt something break inside him. He sat down heavily on a fallen log, and to his surprise, tears came. Not sobs, just silent tears running down his face as weeks of suppressed emotion finally found release. Chen sat next to him, saying nothing, just being present. "I keep seeing their faces," Mitchell finally said. "In my dreams, I see the men this gun has killed. I know it is not logical. I know I was too far away to actually see them clearly, but my mind fills in the details. Young men, old men, scared men, brave men, just men, trying to survive like we are. That means you are still human, sir. That means this war has not taken everything from you yet. They sat together as the sun set over the Pacific, the sky turning brilliant shades of orange and red. In the distance, they could hear the usual sounds of the camp, men talking, equipment being maintained, the occasional bark of an officer giving orders. Normal sounds of military life, as if this was somehow normal, as if any of this could ever be considered normal. The next morning brought new orders. The Marines were preparing for a major offensive to push the Japanese completely off the island. It would be the largest operation yet, involving multiple battalions and concentrated firepower. Mitchell's gun would play a crucial role, assigned to support the main assault force. Lieutenant Hayes briefed them personally. "Gentlemen, tomorrow we are going to end this thing once and for all. The Japanese have concentrated their remaining forces in a defensive line about 3 miles from here. Intelligence suggests they have at least a dozen fortified positions mutually supporting with interlocking fields of fire. It is going to be the toughest fight yet." He paused, looking directly at Mitchell. "Sergeant Mitchell, your weapon has proven itself time and again. Tomorrow it might be the difference between success and catastrophic failure. I need you and your team at your absolute best. Can I count on you?" Mitchell stood straighter, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders once again. "Yes, sir. We will be ready." The night before the assault, Mitchell gathered his team: Torres, Chen, and Kowalski. They had been through so much together, had built something that changed the nature of warfare on this island, had saved countless lives through their innovation and skill. He wanted them to know what they meant to him. "I know I have not been the easiest person to work with lately. I know I have pulled away, gotten too focused on the technical side of things, but I want you all to know that what we have done here, what we have built together, it matters. Not just the gun, but the team. You have kept me sane, kept me human, even when I was trying to turn myself into a machine." Torres grinned. "Somebody had to keep you from completely losing it, Mitch. Besides, who else would put up with your perfectionism?" Chen added his own quiet comment. "We are a team, sir. We succeed together or fail together. Tomorrow is no different than any other day. We do our jobs, we support each other, and we trust that what we have built will work." Kowalski, who rarely spoke, simply nodded. "We have got this, Sergeant. That gun is as good as anything that can be built with what we have. It will not let us down, and neither will we." The assault began at dawn with an artillery barrage that shook the ground and turned the sky orange with explosions. Mitchell and his team were in position on a ridge overlooking the Japanese defensive line, the modified gun set up and ready. They had extra ammunition belts, extra water for cooling, and backup parts for quick repairs. Everything that preparation and experience could provide, they had. When the barrage lifted, the Japanese positions were obscured by smoke and dust. Lieutenant Hayes gave the order, and Mitchell opened fire. This time was different from all the previous engagements. The Japanese had learned about his gun, had heard the reports, and had prepared accordingly. They had dug their positions deeper, reinforced their fortifications, and positioned snipers specifically to target his location. Within seconds of opening fire, bullets began striking around their position, forcing them to take cover between bursts. Torres was hit first, a round catching him in the shoulder as he moved to refill the water jacket. He went down hard, blood spreading across his uniform. Chen immediately moved to help him, applying pressure to the wound while Kowalski took over the water duties. Mitchell kept firing, knowing that if he stopped, the advancing Marines would be exposed to the full weight of the Japanese defensive fire. The gun performed flawlessly despite the incoming fire, its steady roar dominating the battlefield. Mitchell walked rounds across each enemy position, methodically suppressing the machine gun nests that posed the greatest threat to the advancing Marines. He could see American soldiers moving forward in rushes, using every bit of cover, making progress despite the intense resistance. Then, disaster struck. A Japanese mortar round landed 20 feet from their position, and the concussion knocked Mitchell away from the gun. His ears rang, his vision swam, and for a moment he could not remember where he was or what he was doing. When his head cleared, he saw that the gun had been damaged by shrapnel, the ammunition feed mechanism torn apart. Chen was already moving, pulling tools from his pack, his hands steady despite the chaos around them. Kowalski joined him, and together they began emergency repairs, while Mitchell provided covering fire with his rifle. Torres, despite his wound, used his good arm to organize spare parts and hand tools to the other two. The repair took 3 minutes that felt like hours. Every second, Mitchell expected another mortar round to land, to finish what the first had started. But the Japanese gunners were focused on the advancing Marines, and Chen and Kowalski worked with the frantic precision of men who knew lives depended on their speed. "Got it!" Chen shouted, and Mitchell immediately moved back to the gun. He loaded a fresh belt, charged the weapon, and opened fire again. The modified feed mechanism held, and the gun roared back to life. The Marines had used those 3 minutes well. They had covered more than half the distance to the Japanese line, and now, with Mitchell's fire suppressing the defenders again, they made their final push. Mitchell watched them go over the top, watched them assault the fortified positions with rifles, grenades, and bayonets. The fighting was brutal and close, but the Marines had momentum and superior numbers. One by one, the Japanese positions fell. Mitchell shifted his fire to support different sections of the line, always keeping the pressure on, never allowing the defenders time to reorganize or mount an effective counterattack. His arms ached from controlling the recoiling weapon, his ears were bleeding from the concussion and noise, but he did not stop. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than an hour, the Japanese line broke. Those who could retreated deeper into the jungle, abandoning their prepared positions. The Marines had won, had broken the last major defensive line on the island. The cost had been high, dozens of casualties on the American side, but without Mitchell's gun, it would have been far worse. As the firing died down and the smoke began to clear, Mitchell finally released the trigger and sat back. His hands were shaking, his uniform was soaked with sweat, and he could taste blood in his mouth from biting his lip during the fighting. Around him, his team was in similar condition, exhausted, wounded, but alive. Lieutenant Hayes appeared, climbing up to their position with a medic. He took one look at Torres's shoulder wound and called for immediate evacuation. Then he turned to Mitchell. "Sergeant, that was the finest display of covering fire I have ever witnessed. You and your team saved hundreds of lives today. I am recommending all of you for commendations." Mitchell barely heard him. He was staring at the gun, this machine he had created, this monster of metal and innovation. It had done exactly what he designed it to do, had performed beyond all expectations, had changed the course of battles and saved countless American lives. But at what cost to his own soul, at what cost to the humanity he had tried so hard to maintain? Chen put a hand on his shoulder. "We did good work today, sir. Do not forget that." Over the next few days, as the Marines consolidated their hold on the island and the Japanese retreated to isolated pockets, Mitchell had time to think. Torres was evacuated to a hospital ship and would survive, though his war was over. The gun was damaged beyond field repair and would need to be completely rebuilt, and Mitchell himself was exhausted in ways that sleep could not fix. He wrote letters home for the first time in weeks. To his parents, he described the beauty of the Pacific sunsets and the camaraderie of his fellow Marines, leaving out the horror and the violence. To his younger brother, he wrote about the importance of appreciating peace, of valuing every day of normal life, of never taking for granted the simple blessing of not having to kill to survive. One evening, he found himself back at the original crash site, the clearing where he had first found the aircraft gun that would change everything. The wreckage was still there, slowly being reclaimed by the jungle. He sat on a piece of the fuselage and watched the sun set, trying to reconcile the man he had been with the man he had become. Private Chen found him there. "You come here often?" the young man asked with a slight smile. "First time back since we pulled the gun out." Mitchell gestured at the wreckage. "I was just thinking about how random everything is. If this plane had not crashed here, if I had not been assigned to salvage it, if I had not happened to look at that gun and see possibility instead of scrap metal. So many lives changed because of a series of accidents." Chen sat down next to him. "My grandfather used to say that we are all rivers, flowing in the direction the land takes us. We can choose how we flow, fast or slow, rough or smooth, but we cannot change the fact that we are going downhill. You flowed in the direction of that gun because that was where the land took you. What matters is not that you ended up there, but how you handled the journey." That is very philosophical for a kid from San Francisco. My grandfather was a wise man. Also, I am not a kid. I am 19. Chen grinned, and despite everything, Mitchell found himself smiling back. The war on Guadalcanal ended shortly after, though the war in the Pacific would continue for years. Mitchell's modified gun design was studied, refined, and eventually adapted by ordnance engineers. The principle of mounting aircraft weapons for ground use became standard procedure, and similar weapons appeared throughout the remaining campaigns of the war. But Mitchell never built another one. He returned to his role as a regular mechanic, fixing vehicles and maintaining equipment. He trained others in weapons maintenance, passing on his technical knowledge without the innovative spark that had created the gun. He had proven his point, had saved lives through his ingenuity, and now he was content to fade back into the background. On the transport ship that eventually took them away from Guadalcanal, Mitchell stood at the rail watching the island disappear into the distance. Chen joined him, and together they watched in silence. "Do you regret it?" Chen finally asked. "Building the gun, I mean." Mitchell considered the question carefully. "Every day, and every day, I remind myself of the alternative. The Marines we saved, the men who got to go home to their families because we gave them covering fire. The math is brutal and cold, but it is still math. More of our people survived because of what we did. That does not make it easy to live with. No, it does not. But maybe it is not supposed to be easy. Maybe the men who find killing easy are the ones who should worry us." Mitchell turned to face the young private. "You asked me once if I was okay, and I said I was fine. I was lying. I am not fine, and I might never be fine again. But I am learning to live with it, learning to carry it. That is going to have to be enough. For what it is worth, sir, I think you are one of the best men I have ever known. What you built was terrible, but you built it for the right reasons, and you never forgot the cost. That matters. That has to matter." They stood together at the rail as the ship plowed through the Pacific swells, heading toward the next battle, the next island, the next test of courage and endurance. Behind them, Guadalcanal faded into the haze, taking with it the memories of blood and fear, and the sound of a modified aircraft gun that had changed the nature of ground combat. Mitchell thought about his life before the war, about fixing tractors in a peaceful Pennsylvania valley, about days spent under the hood of a car rather than behind a machine gun. He wondered if he would ever be able to return to that life, or if the war had changed him too fundamentally. He wondered if the man who had loved mechanical puzzles just for the joy of solving them could coexist with the man who had killed efficiently and methodically to save his fellow Marines. The answer, he suspected, was that he would spend the rest of his life trying to find out. The gun was gone, left behind on that jungle island, but its legacy remained. In the lives it had saved, in the tactics it had inspired, and in the soul of the mechanic who had created it. Years later, after the war ended and Mitchell returned home, He would sometimes wake in the night to the sound of that gun firing in his dreams. But he would also remember the faces of the men who survived because of it, would receive letters from Marines he had never met, thanking him for giving them covering fire that day on Guadalcanal, would know that his innovation, terrible as it was, had served a purpose. He opened a small garage in his hometown, just like before the war, fixing tractors and automobiles. He rarely spoke about his experiences, never mentioned the gun he had built or the lives it had taken. But on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the sun was setting over the Pennsylvania hills, he would think about Chen's words, that what mattered was not just what he had done, but how he had handled the journey. And in those moments, James Mitchell allowed himself to believe that despite everything, despite the terrible mathematics of war and the blood on his hands, he had remained human. Scarred, changed, carrying burdens that would never fully lift, but human nonetheless. The modified aircraft gun had killed efficiently and saved lives in equal measure. It had been an innovation born of necessity, refined by skill, and wielded with reluctant precision. It represented both the best and worst of what human ingenuity could accomplish when pushed to extremes. But in the end, it was just a machine, a tool built by a man trying to protect his brothers in arms. The real story was not the gun itself, but the mechanic who built it, the team who made it work, and the lives that were forever changed by 3 days of innovation on a jungle island in 1942. Mitchell lived a long life after the war, quiet and productive, marked by service to his community and dedication to his family. He never sought recognition for what he had done, never wrote memoirs or gave interviews. To him, he had simply done his job, used his skills to help his fellow Marines survive, and then tried to move on with his life. But the men who had been there, who had watched that modified gun tear through Japanese fortifications and provide the covering fire that saved their lives, they remembered. They told the story to their children and grandchildren, keeping alive the memory of a mechanic from Pennsylvania who changed the nature of warfare for a few critical weeks on an island most people had never heard of. And perhaps that was enough. Perhaps that was all anyone could ask, to do what needed to be done, to save the lives that could be saved, and then to carry the weight of those choices with as much grace and humanity as possible. The gun was gone, lost to time and rust and the Pacific jungle. But its legacy remained in the men who survived, in the families that were never broken by a telegram, in the lives that continued because one mechanic looked at a piece of aircraft equipment and saw possibility instead of scrap metal. James Mitchell died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, surrounded by family, his hands still bearing the calluses of a lifetime spent working with tools and machines. And on a distant island in the Pacific, slowly being reclaimed by vegetation, the last remnants of a modified aircraft gun rusted away, its story told and retold, but its physical form returning to the earth. War had made Mitchell into something he never wanted to be, a killer of terrifying efficiency, an innovator of death. But humanity and conscience had made him into something more, a man who never forgot the cost of his actions, who carried the weight of his choices without excuse or evasion, who understood that necessity did not erase responsibility. And in the final accounting, when all the mathematics of war were done and all the lives saved and lost were tallied, perhaps that was what mattered most. Not the weapon he built, but the man he remained despite building it. Not the efficiency of the killing, but the preservation of humanity in the face of it. The story of the modified aircraft gun on Guadalcanal became a footnote in military history, studied by tacticians and referenced in technical manuals. But for the men who were there, for the Marines who advanced under its covering fire, it was something more, a memory of a time when innovation and desperation combined to give them a fighting chance. When a mechanic from Pennsylvania looked at a problem and solved it in a way no one else had considered. And for James Mitchell, It remained the defining moment of his life, the point where his skills and knowledge were tested in the most brutal way possible, where he discovered both his capacity for violence and his commitment to preserving his humanity despite it. He had built a monster, but he had never become one, and in the hell of war on a Pacific island, that distinction had made all the difference. The weeks following the major offensive brought an unexpected lull in combat operations. The Japanese forces on Guadalcanal had been pushed into a small pocket on the western end of the island, and while they remained dangerous, they no longer posed the existential threat they once had. For the Marines, this meant time to rest, regroup, and process everything they had been through. Mitchell used this time to completely rebuild the gun from scratch. The damage from the mortar attack had been more extensive than initially thought, and rather than simply repair it, he decided to incorporate all the lessons he had learned from months of combat use. He worked methodically, almost obsessively, losing himself in the technical challenges. Kowalski watched him work one afternoon, noting the almost meditative quality Mitchell brought to the task. "You know, Sarge, I have been thinking about what we built here, not just the gun, but the whole system. The way we work together, anticipate problems, solve issues before they become critical, that is what really makes this thing effective." Mitchell paused in his work, a wrench in his hand. "You are right. The gun is just metal and mechanics. What makes it deadly is the team operating it. Your welds, Chen's feed system, Torres's mounting design, all of it working together. So why do you keep taking all the weight on your shoulders? Why do you act like you are the only one responsible for what this thing does?" The question hit harder than Mitchell expected. He set down the wrench and looked at his friend. "Because I saw the possibility first, because I am the one who convinced Lieutenant Hayes to let us build it. Because every time I close my eyes, I see what it does to people, and I cannot shake the feeling that I opened a door that should have stayed closed." Kowalski sat down on a crate, his expression thoughtful. "My father worked in a steel mill in Chicago, made the beams that went into buildings, bridges, all kinds of structures. One day, a building collapsed. Faulty design by the architect, but my father's steel was in that building. 10 people died. He blamed himself for months, said he should have noticed something, should have done more quality checks, should have refused the order if he had any doubts. What changed his mind? My mother told him something I have never forgotten. She said that a tool is just a tool. The steel did not kill those people. The bad design killed them, and the circumstances that led to that design, and the pressure to cut corners, and 100 other factors. The steel just did what steel does. It held up as long as it could under impossible conditions." Kowalski met Mitchell's eyes. "This gun is the same. It does what guns do. The war put it here. The circumstances made it necessary. You just gave it form." Mitchell wanted to argue, wanted to explain that it was not the same thing, that his gun was designed specifically to kill more efficiently. But deep down, he understood what Kowalski was trying to say. The burden of responsibility was real, but it did not have to be carried alone, and it did not have to define everything he was. The rebuilt gun was ready within a week, incorporating several improvements based on combat experience. The mounting was more stable, the feed mechanism more reliable, and the cooling system more efficient. Mitchell test-fired it one morning, and it performed flawlessly. But he found himself hoping that it would never be needed again, that the war on this island was effectively over. That hope was premature. Intelligence reported that the Japanese were planning one final attack, a desperate attempt to break through the Marine lines and recapture Henderson Field, the airstrip that had been the objective of so much fighting. If they succeeded, it would undo months of progress and sacrifice. If they failed, it would likely mean the end of organized Japanese resistance on Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Hayes called Mitchell to a planning session with the battalion staff. The command tent was crowded with officers studying maps and discussing defensive positions. When Mitchell entered, Hayes waved him over to a large map spread across a makeshift table. "Sergeant, intelligence suggests the Japanese will attack along this axis," the lieutenant said, pointing to a section of the line. "They have been moving troops and supplies for days, and we think they are planning a night assault, probably in the next 48 hours. I want your gun here, on this ridge, where it can cover the most likely approach routes." Mitchell studied the map, his mind already working through the tactical considerations. The ridge position was good, with clear fields of fire and decent cover, but it was also exposed, particularly the flanks. If the Japanese sent infiltrators around the sides, the gun crew would be vulnerable. "Sir, I recommend we set up secondary positions here and here," Mitchell said, pointing to 2 spots on the map. "Small teams with machine guns to protect our flanks. The Japanese will know we are there once we start firing, and they will try to take us out. We need defense in depth." Hayes nodded approvingly. "Good thinking, Sergeant. I will assign 2 fire teams to support your position. You will have radio communication with the battalion command post, and we will have mortar support available if you need it. Your job is to break up their attack, disrupt their formations, and buy time for the rest of the line to respond." The next 2 days were spent in preparation. Mitchell and his team worked around the clock to ensure everything was perfect. They pre-positioned ammunition, established range markers, rehearsed emergency procedures, and coordinated with the infantry teams that would protect their flanks. Chen created a detailed range card, marking every significant feature in their field of fire. Kowalski built a reinforced fighting position, using sandbags and logs to create protection from incoming fire. Torres, still recovering from his shoulder wound, insisted on being part of the operation despite the protests of the medical staff. His arm was in a sling, but he could still help with ammunition handling and provide an extra pair of eyes. Nobody wanted him there, but nobody had the heart to tell him he could not be. The night of the attack, the jungle was eerily quiet. The usual sounds of insects and night birds were absent, as if the creatures of the island sensed the coming violence and had withdrawn to safety. Mitchell lay behind the gun, his hands resting on the grips, his eyes scanning the darkness. The moon was a thin crescent, providing barely enough light to see shapes and shadows. Chen was next to him, ready with ammunition. Kowalski and Torres were in the fighting position behind them, monitoring the radio and preparing backup equipment. The infantry fire teams were positioned on the flanks, invisible in the darkness but reassuring in their presence. Mitchell checked his watch. It was just after midnight. If intelligence was right, the attack would come in the next few hours, probably around 3 in the morning, when defenders would be at their lowest state of alertness. He forced himself to relax, to conserve energy, knowing that when the fighting started, there would be no time for rest. The first sign of the attack was not something he saw, but something he felt, a change in the air, a sense of presence where none should be. He tapped Chen on the shoulder and pointed toward their front. The young Marine peered into the darkness, then nodded slowly. Movement, lots of it. Mitchell keyed the radio handset. "Command, this is Mitchell. We have movement to our front. Multiple contacts, preparing to engage." The radio crackled. "Roger, Mitchell, hold fire until you have clear targets. We are moving reserves into position." The waiting was agony. Mitchell could see shapes now, dozens of them, moving through the jungle with practiced stealth. The Japanese were advancing in a broad front, using the terrain expertly, staying low and moving during the moments when clouds covered the moon. They were good, professional soldiers who knew their business. Then a flare shot up from the Marine lines, turning night into artificial day. The battlefield was suddenly illuminated, revealing hundreds of Japanese soldiers caught in the open, their attack exposed before it could gain momentum. For a frozen moment, both sides stared at each other across the killing ground. Mitchell opened fire. The modified gun roared to life, and the effect was catastrophic for the attackers. Men who had been advancing confidently suddenly found themselves under fire from a weapon that should not exist at ground level. The heavy rounds tore through multiple bodies, shredded vegetation, and created absolute chaos in the Japanese formations. But this time was different from previous engagements. These were not defenders in fixed positions, but attackers with momentum and numerical superiority. They did not break and run. Instead, they pushed forward, accepting horrific casualties to close the distance with the Marine lines. Mitchell swept the gun back and forth, creating lanes of death, but for every man who fell, another stepped forward to take his place. The battle quickly became desperate. The infantry teams on the flanks opened fire as Japanese soldiers tried to work around the gun position. Grenades exploded, rifles cracked, and men screamed in multiple languages. Mitchell kept the gun firing, methodically engaging targets, trusting his team to keep the weapon fed and cooled. Then the Japanese mortars found them. The first round landed 30 feet away, showering them with dirt and rock. The second was closer. Mitchell knew that the third would likely hit them directly, and there was nothing he could do about it. He could not abandon the gun, could not stop firing, because if he did, the Marines in the positions below them would be overwhelmed. Chen seemed to read his mind. "Keep firing, Sergeant. We have got this." The young private grabbed Kowalski and Torres, and together they began constructing an improvised overhead cover using logs and sandbags. They worked with frantic speed while Mitchell continued to pour fire into the attacking Japanese forces. It was insane, trying to build fortifications while in the middle of a firefight, but it was also brilliant in its desperation. The third mortar round hit just as they finished, exploding against the overhead cover they had built. The structure held, barely, and while the concussion was tremendous, the shrapnel that would have killed them all was absorbed by the logs and sandbags. Mitchell felt blood running down his face from the overpressure, but he kept his hands on the gun, kept firing. The Japanese attack reached its crescendo. Soldiers were now within grenade range, and the defending Marines fought with everything they had. Mitchell's gun was the anchor of the defense, the point around which the entire battle pivoted. As long as he kept firing, as long as he could keep breaking up the Japanese formations, the line would hold. Time lost all meaning. Mitchell fired until the barrel glowed red, even with the water cooling, fired until his shoulders ached from controlling the recoil, fired until he could not feel his fingers. Chen went through belt after belt of ammunition, his hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the chaos around them. Kowalski and Torres used their rifles to engage Japanese soldiers who got too close, protecting the gun crew from infiltrators. And then, gradually, the Japanese attack began to falter. The combination of devastating firepower and stubborn defense had broken their momentum. Men who had been attacking with suicidal courage began to hesitate, to seek cover, to retreat. Mitchell shifted his fire to pursue them, making sure they understood that retreat was not safety, that the killing ground extended far beyond the Marine defensive line. As dawn broke over Guadalcanal, the battlefield was revealed in all its horror. Hundreds of bodies lay scattered across the approaches to the Marine positions, testament to the ferocity of the fighting and the effectiveness of modern weapons. Mitchell finally released the trigger, his hands shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. Lieutenant Hayes appeared, climbing up to their position with a medic. His uniform was torn and blood-stained, and his face showed the strain of the night's fighting. He looked at Mitchell's team, at the gun that was still smoking despite the morning coolness, at the empty ammunition cans scattered around the position. "Sergeant Mitchell, that was the longest night of my life, and you and your team are the reason we survived it. That gun fired continuously for over 4 hours. I have never seen anything like it." Hayes paused, emotion evident in his voice. "You saved this battalion. You know that, right?" Mitchell looked out at the battlefield, at the cost of their victory, "We did what we had to do, sir, just like everyone else." The lieutenant studied him for a moment, understanding passing between them. "Yes, Sergeant. We all did what we had to do, and we will live with it for the rest of our lives." The Japanese attack had been their last major effort. After that night, organized resistance on Guadalcanal collapsed rapidly. Within 2 weeks, the island was declared secure, and the Marines began preparing to move on to the next objective in the island-hopping campaign across the Pacific. Mitchell's gun was finally retired. The barrel was worn beyond safe use, the receiver was cracked from stress, and multiple components had been damaged during the final battle. It had served far beyond its design specifications, had performed miracles of mechanical endurance, but it was finally done. Mitchell personally oversaw its destruction, using a cutting torch to render it permanently inoperable. He did not want this particular weapon to fall into anyone's hands, did not want it rebuilt or studied too closely. The team stood together as the gun was cut apart, watching in silence. It had been their creation, their responsibility, their burden, and now it was being reduced to scrap metal, returning to the state in which they had found it. Torres, his arm still in a sling, spoke first. "We built something that mattered. We built something that brought our guys home. Whatever else it was, whatever else it did, that has to count for something." Chen nodded slowly. "My grandfather told me that in war there are no good choices, only less terrible ones. We made the less terrible choice. We gave our Marines a fighting chance." Kowalski added his own perspective. "Every weld I made on that gun, I thought about the men it would protect. Not the men it would kill, but the men it would save. That is what I am going to remember." Mitchell watched the cutting torch consume the weapon that had defined his war. "I am going to remember all of it. The men we saved and the men we killed, the necessity and the cost, the pride and the shame, all of it. Because if I forget any part of it, if I make it simpler than it was, then I dishonor everyone who was touched by what we did." In the months that followed, as the war moved on to other islands and other battles, Mitchell returned to his role as a regular mechanic. He maintained vehicles, repaired weapons, and trained new Marines in basic maintenance procedures. He never built another innovative weapon, never sought recognition for what he had accomplished, but his reputation preceded him. New Marines would whisper and point when he walked by, telling stories about the legendary gun that had changed the course of battles. Officers would seek his advice on technical problems, respecting his expertise even if they did not fully understand the burden he carried. One day, several months after leaving Guadalcanal, Mitchell received a letter from home. His mother wrote about life in their small Pennsylvania town, about neighbors and relatives, about the garden she was maintaining and the church social events she attended. It was a window into a world that seemed impossibly distant, a reminder that somewhere life continued in a normal, peaceful way. She also mentioned that several families in town had received telegrams notifying them of sons who had been killed in the Pacific. Mitchell recognized some of the names. They were boys he had grown up with, had played baseball with in the summer, had sat next to in church. The war was no longer an abstract thing happening somewhere else. It had reached into his hometown, into his community, taking young men who should have lived long lives. He wrote back that evening, sitting on his cot with a flickering kerosene lamp, providing barely enough light to see. He told his mother about the beauty of the Pacific sunsets, about the friends he had made, about the technical challenges of maintaining equipment in a tropical environment. He did not mention the gun, did not describe the battles, did not explain what he had become. But he did write one paragraph that surprised him with its honesty. "Mom, I want you to know that everything I have done here, everything I have built and fixed and created, was done to bring our guys home safely. I cannot talk about the details, and maybe I never will, but I need you to know that I tried to make a difference. I tried to save lives. I hope that when this is all over and I come home, You will be proud of me despite everything." Chen found him later that night, still sitting on his cot, staring at the letter he had just sealed. The young Marine sat down next to him without invitation, a gesture that had become familiar between them. "Letter home?" Chen asked. "Yeah. First honest thing I have written to them since we landed on Guadalcanal. Not completely honest, but more honest than before. That is progress. My parents do not even know where I am, just somewhere in the Pacific. I write them about the weather and the food and the guys in my unit. I tell them I am safe, I am well, I am learning a lot. All technically true, but missing the essential truth of what this is really like." "Do you think we will ever be able to tell them?" Mitchell asked. "Do you think there will come a day when we can sit down with people who were not here and explain what we did, what we saw, what we became?" Chen considered the question carefully. Some of it, maybe. The facts, the events, the basic narrative. But the feeling of it, the weight of it, the way it changes you from the inside out, I do not think that can be explained. I think that stays with us. They sat together in comfortable silence, two young men far from home, bound together by shared experience and mutual understanding. Around them, the camp was settling in for the night, the usual sounds of military life providing a backdrop to their reflection. The war in the Pacific continued for another 3 years after Guadalcanal. Mitchell served throughout, moving from island to island, maintaining the mechanical systems that kept the Marine Corps functioning. He never again built anything like the modified aircraft gun, but his reputation as a problem solver and innovator remained. When equipment failed in the field, Mitchell was the man officers called. When vehicles broke down in impossible conditions, Mitchell found ways to fix them. He was promoted to staff sergeant, then to technical sergeant, but rank meant little to him. What mattered were the small victories: a truck engine that started when it should not have, a weapon that fired when lives depended on it, a generator that provided power for a field hospital. These were contributions he could feel good about, improvements that saved lives without requiring him to take them. Chen stayed with him throughout, becoming his unofficial assistant and closest friend. The young Marine had a gift for understanding complex systems and an intuition for troubleshooting that complemented Mitchell's mechanical expertise perfectly. Together, they formed a team that became legendary throughout the division. Torres returned to duty after his wound healed, but he was transferred to a different unit. They exchanged letters occasionally, brief notes about shared memories and hopes for the future. Kowalski was killed on Tarawa, dying in the first wave of the assault on that blood-soaked beach. Mitchell heard the news weeks later and spent that night alone, crying for the first time since leaving Guadalcanal, mourning the loss of a friend who had understood him in ways few others could. As the war drew toward its conclusion, Mitchell found himself thinking more about the future. What would he do when peace came? How would he transition from military life to civilian existence? Could he return to his small Pennsylvania town and resume the simple life he had known before? Or had he changed too much, seen too much, done too much? The answer came in August of 1945, when atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Japan's surrender. The war was over. Millions of men in uniform suddenly faced the prospect of returning home, of rebuilding lives that had been interrupted by years of combat. Mitchell's discharge came through in December, along with Chen's. They traveled home together as far as San Francisco, where they would part ways, Chen to his family in California and Mitchell to his family in Pennsylvania. On their last night together, they sat in a bar near the port, nursing beers and talking about everything and nothing. "What are you going to do?" Chen asked. "Back in Pennsylvania, I mean. Resume the mechanic work?" "I think so. It is what I know, what I am good at." Mitchell stared into his beer. "But it is going to be different. Every time I look at an engine, I am going to see that gun. Every time I solve a mechanical problem, I'm going to wonder if I am creating something that could be weaponized. The war changed how I see everything. Chen nodded slowly. I know what you mean. I'm going back to school, going to finish my engineering degree, but I keep thinking about all the ways engineering can be used to kill people. The bridges that can be targeted, the buildings that can collapse, the systems that can fail. It is like the war taught us to see the destructive potential in everything. Maybe that is not a bad thing, Mitchell said thoughtfully. Maybe seeing the potential for destruction makes us more careful, more thoughtful about what we build and why. Maybe the men who remember the cost are the ones who should be building the future. They finished their beers and shook hands, knowing that despite their promises to stay in touch, life would likely pull them in different directions. But the bond forged in war, the shared experience of creation and destruction, would remain part of who they were forever. Mitchell's train pulled out of San Francisco the next morning, beginning the long journey across the continent. He watched the country roll by, marveling at its size and diversity, at the millions of people who had never experienced war directly, who lived their lives in blessed ignorance of what humans could do to each other when pushed to extremes. When he finally arrived home, his parents were waiting at the small-town train station. His mother cried. His father gripped his shoulder with emotion too deep for words. And for a moment, Mitchell felt like maybe he could reclaim some of what he had lost. Maybe he could be their son again, the mechanic who fixed tractors and helped neighbors, the young man who had left 4 years earlier. But that night, lying in his childhood bed, listening to the familiar sounds of a peaceful town, Mitchell knew that he would never fully be that person again. The war had taken something from him that could not be recovered, had added something that could not be removed. He was a hybrid now, part of the man he had been and part of something darker, more complex, forever marked by what he had created and what it had done. The modified aircraft gun existed now only in memory and in military reports, but its legacy lived on in the tactics it inspired, in the lives it saved, and in the soul of the mechanic who built it. James Mitchell would spend the rest of his life trying to balance those accounts, trying to ensure that the good he had done outweighed the harm, trying to remain human despite everything war had asked him to become. And perhaps, in the end, that striving was enough. Perhaps the effort to remain moral in immoral circumstances, to preserve humanity in inhuman conditions, to create in service of preservation rather than destruction, was its own form of victory. Not a clean victory, not an uncomplicated one, but a victory nonetheless. The gun was gone, but the man remained, scarred, complicated, burdened by memory but not broken by it, still capable of love, still capable of creation, still capable of choosing how to use his gifts and knowledge, still human, despite everything, and in the moral calculus of war, perhaps that was the greatest victory of all.